Did you know that Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders are among the fastest growing groups in the United States? And their stories have been centuries in the making. Join me as we explore objects, many of which are rarely seen by the public, collected by the largest museum, education, and research center in the world, the Smithsonian Institution.
Whoa, what is that?
Together, we'll investigate the stories behind those objects and learn how these communities continue to shape U.S. history and culture. When Chinese immigrants began arriving in large numbers to the United States in the mid-1800s, they gathered with others who shared the same language and hometown affiliations to find community. These Chinatowns, as they became known, eventually appeared in major cities across the country. Chinatowns were safe havens for Chinese who were racially excluded and ostracized by an often hostile America. Sometimes Chinatowns became visible targets of intense prejudice and even violence. They also served as places to find jobs, worship, socialize, and maintain connections to Chinese culture. For generations, these communities thrived. But in recent years, population in some Chinatowns have decreased. And now, historians are in a race to preserve their history and keep their legacy alive.
Today, I'm hitting the road with Dr. Sam Vong, a curator with the Department of Work and Industry at the National Museum of American History. Sam travels the country in search of objects that tell compelling stories, particularly ones that can offer a window into the lives of Asian American and Pacific Islander individuals and communities. So I guess your job takes you to some cool places?
Yeah, it's taken me to a lot of different places all over the country on these what we call look-see visits. And you look and see if the objects would be good candidates for the museum to collect.
Very cool.
Now we're headed to Baltimore to meet this prospective donor, Kathie Lee, and she has discovered a bunch of amazing photographs and a briefcase that may contain some really interesting stuff. I think this is going to be a very exciting trip. Hi, Kathie. Thanks for inviting us.
Come on in.
Oh my goodness. Gillian, check out this stuff.
Kathie, this is an incredible collection.
Kathie, can you tell us a little bit about what you have laid out here?
This is a collection of photographs and documents, different things that belong to my family. One of the reasons I've started collecting these is I think that these objects start to tell the really important story of early Chinese families in Baltimore, starting from about 100 years ago. You know, I've been collecting these materials for a couple of years now. It all started during the pandemic. My dad handed me this briefcase and he said, you know, here, take a look at this. And so I opened it up. This was his dad's briefcase. The first thing I pulled out was this envelope. And when I looked at it, I was like, Dad, this says 1920 on it is the postmark, which was curious. It was 2020 at the time. So that was the beginning of it.
So this briefcase is kind of like a time capsule into your family's history and also Baltimore's Chinese community, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this was the starting point. So once I started with this, it just kind of piqued my interest and I started poking around, looking in closets.
So this is a lot of material and a lot of work you're putting into going through all of this. What is your goal? What's your hope with this?
My goal is sort of figuring out our family story. I feel like if you don't take the time, it's going to get lost. This collection sort of helps to tell the story of early Chinese families in Baltimore. It wasn't a large group of people, so it's interesting how some of the threads come together. I just want to make sure that we gather as many stories as we can in the time that we have. Time goes quickly. It's precious, and in a blink of an eye, you could lose those stories. So that's part of my goal, is just to find the stories, remember the stories, share the stories, so that we have them.
Thank you, Kathie, for showing Gillian and I these amazing objects. I'm going to photograph these objects and then have a conversation with my curatorial colleagues and the Archive Center and get back to you.
This was amazing, Kathie. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Baltimore's Chinatown, like so many other Chinatowns in the United States, was once a thriving city within a city, a bustling cultural hub that served the Chinese American community. However, in recent decades, the population has gradually declined.
To find out why, we'll ask Dr. Madeline Xu, Director of the Center for Global Migration Studies at the University of Maryland. Madeline is a professor in the Asian American Studies program and studies the history of Chinatowns in the United States.
So Professor Xu, tell me a little bit about the history of Chinese Americans in Baltimore.
So the history of Chinese in Baltimore is actually older than most people probably realize. As early as 1785, we know that there were 3 Chinese who arrived on the ship the Palace, and the ship's captain had recruited them to be sailors, had decided to change out his crew and just dump them in Baltimore. In terms of a Chinese American community, we start having a couple of Chinese show up on the census in 1870, but it's not until 1890 that we have more of a communities. But there hasn't been that much research conducted on Chinese in Baltimore. We do know that people still ended up having to congregate in a Chinatown area. This is around the 300 block of Park Street. They seem also to have faced some employment discrimination. They were mostly running laundries and then also restaurants, also working as laborers, but also what we see in Baltimore is that we have this Chinatown community. In part, it is there because of discrimination.
So how have Chinatowns evolved over the last century?
Fortunately, in some communities, there has been a diminishing of the kinds of discriminations that force Chinese Americans to live in Chinatowns. Another factor that we find is that Chinese Americans are facing less in the way of employment discriminations. And so these 2 factors mean that many Chinese Americans now have this option of moving out of urban Chinatowns, which had very poor housing stock. There also were often issues around sanitation and health standards. And so in some cases, we see Chinatowns really diminishing and disappearing. This is certainly the case with Baltimore. So Baltimore's historic Chinatown area has all but disappeared. This could be called ethnic succession. We have a new influx of immigrants also sort of being channeled into similar kinds of businesses and endeavors that had characterized the earliest of Chinese Americans trying to make their way in Baltimore.
We've just taken a look at some amazing artifacts that were preserved from a member of the Baltimore Chinatown community. Can you tell me a little bit about why it's so significant to hang on to these things?
For us to know and understand Chinese American perspectives, how they were experiencing the different phases of discrimination, but then also opportunity, also outreach, we need these kinds of artifacts. We need photographs, we need letters, we need receipts, we need business records so that we can see how they navigated, what their perspectives were. Otherwise, so much of these perspectives would be lost to history. What we would rely on are census counts and newspaper accounts, which can give us information, but they're definitely from an outside perspective and don't really help us understand the humanity of being a Chinese American in Baltimore.
Appreciating the historical significance Chinatowns have played in cities across the United States is an important key to understanding any great city's larger history.
Today, Chinatowns are under threat due to gentrification and urban development, which is why the work conducted by Kathie Lee is so important. The suitcase, photos, and letters that Kathie has shown us serve as important time capsules of not only her family's past, but also a lesser-known history of Baltimore's Chinatown. Together, these objects help paint a picture of what life was like in these communities 100 years ago, and safeguarding them in museums will ensure their stories live on.
How do the objects in your family preserve your community's stories?